Okay, looks like our numbers are stabilizing. So welcome everyone, and thank you for attending our panel session, Data Support Services Needs in the DIY Era at the RDAP Summit 2022. This is a Zoom webinar. Attendees are muted and your cameras are turned off. So to ask a question of our panelists, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen and put your questions in there. This session will run from 12:45 to 1:45 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, with the last 15 minutes dedicated for a Q&A. If you have a very specific question for only one of our panelists, please indicate their name, or if you're directing your question to all panelists when you type your question into the Q&A. And after the session, please feel free to drop further questions and continue the conversation in the chat in Whova. Just a note about our code of conduct: the Research Data Access and Preservation and the RDAP Summit organizers are committed to providing an environment where all attendees can participate fully in the program and activities without fear of harassment or discriminatory behavior of any kind. There is a code of conduct helper, there's actually two, available during this session, Reed or Emily. They're identified with COC helper by their name, and you can direct messages to them in Whova. Also, if you need assistance, if you're not able to send them a direct message within this Zoom webinar, you can find them listed within Whova. They can also give you the code of conduct email address or link to the incident report form if needed. So I'm going to pass the virtual mic over to our moderator, who's going to introduce the session and our panelists further. So Dylan, take it away.
Thanks. Welcome everyone to today's panel. And I'd like to, on behalf of myself and the participants today, thank the program committee for giving us the opportunity to speak today. This is going to be a roundtable discussion, pretty informal, between myself and my co-panelists, and we will leave at least 15 minutes for questioning at the end. Our purpose for gathering today is to discuss some of the findings from a recent Ithaca S&R research project, which tracked research practices and support needs of researchers working with big data. This project was conducted in partnership with 23 university libraries, and together the partnering institutions that participated in the project interviewed over 200 researchers from really just about every discipline you can imagine being practiced inside of a university setting about their use of big data in their research, their methodologies, where they find their data to work with, how they access and discover that data, how they generate their own data, and also what kinds of support needs they have and how well those needs are being met by units on campus, including, quite prominently, university libraries. Each team participating in the project, the 23 university library teams, produced a local report that focused on analysis of the interviews that they conducted with instructors on their campuses and offered campus-specific insights and recommendations about the infrastructure for supporting data-intensive research on their specific campus. Using those and the interviews as raw material, Ithaca S&R, in this case primarily me, produced a national report that kind of synthesized what we were seeing across campuses and provided recommendations for institutions, publishers, scholarly societies, other stakeholders in this space on a kind of national landscape level. The report is available on the Ithaca S&R website. The local reports are available in university repositories. And there's a lot of really rich stuff inside them. We are going to be focusing today on one specific finding area inside of the reports, and that has to do with how libraries can best support big data researchers as they go about their work. My name is Dylan Riediger. I'm a senior analyst at Ithaca S&R, which is a nonprofit research organization that specializes in studying how technological change is affecting scholarly communication and scholarly communities. And I'm joined today by librarians from 4 different campuses that participated in the project. In no particular order, Neelam Bharti, who is the Associate Dean of Research and a Senior Librarian at Carnegie Mellon University. Susan Ivey, the Director of Research Facilitation Services at North Carolina State University, Ben Gorham, who is a Research Data Specialist at Case Western Reserve University, and Jen Ferguson, the Head of Research Data Services at Northeastern University, are our panelists today. And yes, I will put the Ithaca report in the chat. Our format today is that we're going to be in a round table. I'll ask some questions for the panelists, and as I mentioned at the top, we'll leave ample room for Q&A from the audience. First, I'd like to turn primarily to Ben and Neelam, though Susan or Jen, if you have something to add, feel free to chime in as well. And just ask the two of you what you learned about researchers' expectations and need for support around big data on your campuses. And I'll leave it up to the two of you to decide who wants to jump in first.
Neelam, you can go first.
Oh, thank you, Ben. So, and thank you, Dylan, and the other panelists. So, during our interview to the researcher and faculty who were working on big data project, there were a couple of challenges which came into the spectrum, and they were related mostly to the planning and publishing and communications, and could be, I would say, it put back into the different buckets of process, technology, and maybe some institutional and local challenges. So including those challenges were lack of technical trainings, which is one of the very specific area where the researcher expects libraries to pitch in. And that was brought into the conversation for the professional development to further take it to there. And the expectation in there was that university as well as the library should provide some opportunities for the professional development, for the data management training and data education. So with that, the process challenge came up as a data storage, which probably more like a technology problem, and libraries can help only up to a certain limit there, such as providing institutional repository and space to submit the data sets and the data reports. But for the working data, it's more institutional or infrastructural issue. Other challenge or other expectation, should I say, was from the researcher that specific to CMU, CMU have a different landscape of big data research, and we have some units on campus, such as Software Institute, which is working mainly as a government contractor. So they have a different security and a different need for their big data research, whereas rest of the campus who work on the grants or their own research projects are not really so restricted in the research perspective for big data. So we have, from CMU perspective, it's expected that we have two different or two separate parallel lines for the big data research or big data infrastructure that include the storage, that include the data security, and the data quality control. That was another thing which came up during our interviews. Other thing, the researcher really expect, or should I say, they really have challenges in publication venue. Since big data research is very focused on unique niche areas, they really have trouble in finding the publication venues, and data interoperability is an issue there, how they submit that data, how they provide it for the wider access. So in that case also, libraries can and should advocate for a good data infrastructure, but itself as a library, there are limitations to that as well. Where libraries can pitch in more for is providing support for the trainings. What most of the researcher mentioned, they do have some support, but they would like to know more. And marketing our services, which are existing services which are already there, but the researcher had no idea that library provide that service. So this is, I would say, a low-hanging fruit. Whatever services we provide for the big data, we reach out to the researcher and to the campus to have a more strategic market planning to market those services. Ben?
Yes, thank you for that. And thank you for this introduction, Dylan, and this opportunity to speak with everyone. I think that as we might expect, as part of the course of this survey, this project, we encountered a pretty wide variety of not just the needs that our researchers have, but also the diversity in the responses that they give across institutions and across disciplines. So I'm going to echo some things that Neelam was saying, and I'm going to depart from others as well. In our institution, Case Western, we did have a number of expectations communicated to us from our participants around need for training in data storage and sharing solutions. So where can they put this data? How can they make it publicly available? And I think to do so in a way that reduces barriers to access and reduces barriers for them for upload, right? Make it easier for them to make it public, and then make it easier for the public to get it as well. And that level of expectation for library support or institutional support was largely just around introductory levels of what tools are out there, how can I use them, can you make them available to me and my team? And then kind of hand in hand with that, although sort of on the earlier side of the research life cycle, was a need for education around DMPs, data management plans. Quite often we encounter people who have never heard of data management plans and have no interest in pursuing them until someone makes it seem like a good idea. So kind of making that a more forward-facing element of good research data lifecycle, teaching people how to build a good data management plan and how to support that throughout the process of the big data research project are some of the needs that were identified and communicated at our institution. That said, we had a lot of respondents who did not express any expectation or need around training or support from the library or related departments with respect to working with big data, either with the tools or with the analysis itself. They did not come to the library. They don't come to more widely writ academic institutions for support in those avenues, with the exception being software access. They need to know what good platforms are out there to crunch their numbers in, to process their data in. Do we have access to that through the library? Can they use it on our machines? Can we just give it to them? That kind of thing. What the expectations we noticed instead was that they were kind of directed internally, sort of siloed microcosmic ideas around institutional knowledge, in that a research lab, especially one that's been running for a long time, has this training built into its process, has this institutionalized knowledge, either with the PI, the PIs, senior research assistants, people who've been associated with the lab for a long time, and any questions or needs that they had around training or support with their big data and its analytics, they would just direct internally. So there's this sort of this passing of the torch that was happening across many, many different research groups at our institution. So instead of looking towards a centralized solution, people were siloing their solutions and tailoring them to their own research needs, and then just keeping that tradition alive for the lifespan of their project. The only other place we would find them directing needs or expectations around training and support externally would be to the high-powered computing center or the secure research environment. So if there are needs for just extraordinarily high HPC computational processing capacity, or exceptionally secure, like air-gapped research spaces to do their work, that's where they would go as well. But those are very kind of specific needs and expectations. So not really more of the general trend that we would see. I hope that answers the question, Ari, Dylan.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you both. I mean, I think between the two answers, you get a sense of both the variety of issues that arose over the course of these interviews, whether having to do with data storage, with software training, with data management, with workflow management, with security, with ethics, with publishing issues, repository issues, things about interoperability, and as Ben has kind of demonstrated, those needs varied quite a bit from discipline to discipline, from lab to lab, and also directed researchers sometimes very internally towards their own resources, sometimes to a really wide variety of units across campus, which suggests something about the kind of decentralized landscape for research data support on many university campuses. I'd like to turn now to Jen and Susan in particular and ask, you've just heard Neelam and Ben describe what the support needs on their campuses looked like and what kind of expectations researchers had about where they could go to help and what kind of help they needed. My question for you, I guess, is, first of all, if there's anything on either of your universities that really diverged from those patterns. And then more broadly, how well do researchers' sense of expectations and needs align with the kinds of services that university libraries are either already providing or are capable of providing? What's the level of fit between needs and resources on your campuses right now? And how do libraries really, as Ben has kind of alluded to already, there are lots of potential players on campus who are going to be providing certain kinds of support. The library is a central actor in these, but isn't always the one that's on the radar of researchers. How do libraries kind of stake a claim to being an important part of this infrastructure?
That is a big question.
Several big questions.
Several big questions. In my experience, and here I'm speaking as a person who started out in biology and then moved into libraries, I think especially for STEM researchers who, and those were not everyone we spoke to for this study, but a lot of the researchers working in big data for us were in engineering and science. Libraries aren't usually top of mind for those folks when they're thinking data. I think, Ben, you already alluded to this a bit. And I think that is in part because their sort of existing concept or mental map of what a library is and what a library does, the idea of libraries supporting and working with data doesn't fit neatly into that. And when they have data issues, I think, again, to echo you, Ben, if they think of a central service at all, they think of IT to solve those. More often, I think they solve them on their own in silos. And that's certainly a challenge for us. I don't think it's all dire, though. One place I think we stake a claim is, it sort of gets back to a faculty member that we interviewed for this project. He described his career as the slow accumulation of spoils, where he spent decades attracting to himself infrastructure, data sets, expertise, funding. And he noted that research is this sort of self-perpetuating cycle in which better supported faculty members at well-resourced institutions produce more and more publications. They get more citations. That tends to all attract more collaborators. It tends to attract more funding. And this serves to privilege some while shutting others out. It disadvantages some researchers, like early career researchers, those with fewer resources at their disposal, whether that's because their discipline tends to attract funding that is, a lower dollar amount than other disciplines, or because the support available at their institution isn't as robust as at others. So it's this unfortunate cycle where the rich get richer, and it's hard for others to sort of jump in and enter that whirlpool. And he said, he sees this problem, it bothers him. He said, I try to help. I try to give other people a leg up. I try to give people access to my data sets when I can. I try to let them, use the infrastructure that we've built, but that shouldn't be my job. I already have a full-time job, and then some. I don't need to be doing this too. So I tell this lengthy anecdote because to me, that is a sweet spot for us. That's a sweet spot for libraries. to me, it feels very well aligned with how people think of libraries and what we do, and even how we think of ourselves on our best days as organizations and people that exist to try to help level that playing field, to provide infrastructure, services, and resources to help democratize access to information, right? That's what we're all about. Try to make that data future more inclusive. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jen. I think I'm going to pick up right where you left off about sort of the sweet spot for libraries. I think the way, Dylan, that you sort of asked it was sort of how can libraries stake a claim in the data support service space, and like what kind of things can they do and what kind of things can't they do? And I think, as we know, and we've heard all week, that there are so many different libraries and different institutions and libraries at academic institutions that are doing really amazing things in the data space and really different things. And it really is dependent on your local context, your goals, your resources, and all of that. I think we're good at it. Do researchers sort of understand what we do? I don't think all the time, as we've already mentioned before. One sort of thing that we've been doing at NC State is really thinking about situating ourselves as sort of a connector on campus. That's sort of how I see libraries anyhow. We're really good at sort of understanding what's going on campus and helping people find the information they need, whether it's information we're giving them, creating for them, or whether it's just connecting them elsewhere. And so I think one opportunity for academic libraries, and something that we're fortunate to be able to explore at NC State currently, is how we situate ourselves within the research, computing, and data landscape. We heard a great talk about this on day one, the RCD umbrella, and the survey results from the workforce survey that they did. And I think they mentioned that a lot of data folks or data librarians didn't sort of see how they fit into this RCD ecosystem. And so I think that's where, libraries are great. So we're working on something called the Research Facilitation Service. And we are sort of leading that within the libraries, but collaborating with Central IT and our Office of Research for the effort. And so we are trying to connect the dots for the things. And we're fortunate in that the Ithaca study, the challenges that were highlighted, the infrastructure challenges, the security and compliance challenges, the publication challenges, the training, not being able to find like deep enough training challenges, all of that are things that we were trying to sort of address with this research facilitation service. So keying researchers into, if it's something the libraries does provide, so what we do locally for data, we have a data viz, DMP reviews, consulting on how to publish data, or if it's something the Data Science Academy that we have might do, which is a little more in-depth and advanced training, or connecting them to the computing resources that they need. Like, it's all connected, how we see it. So we're really working on this initiative to sort of bring those pieces together. And the other thing I think I want to note is that, and we put this in our report, that the challenges that we heard from our big data participants aren't necessarily unique to people only working with big data. It's challenges that everybody across the board that works with data has. There's some are different, and they might look different, such as data storage and things that the previous panelists have mentioned. But it's a challenge if you have any data that you're working with, I feel like. So I think I'll leave there.
Great. Thank you both for those responses. I want to pick up on a term that you used, Susan, in your response, where you're talking about the ecosystem of data support. And one of the things that really struck me in reading through the interviews and the local reports for this project was, first of all, how many different disciplines were collectively represented in the report. It was really, really stunning that every discipline is now participating in big data research. And also, so there was a question of like breadth of disciplines who are involved in this. And also that when we think about the researchers who are conducting the research, it really encompassed basically the full range of people who are affiliated with the university. You have very large labs, particularly in STEM fields, who have undergraduates, graduate students, postdoc, university staff inside their lab, working for their departments, working at research centers, working for various university units at the library, et cetera, and so forth. And collectively, what that created for me was a picture of the big data researcher as, in fact, a number of different subcategories that might have overlapping and very distinctive needs for support. An undergrad might need different things than a full professor, for example. Somebody who's doing big data research out of an English department may have very different access to resources and certain kinds of quantitative skills than someone who's working, in computational physics or something. This would be a question, I think, for all four of you or any combination of you who'd like to jump in. But have you learned anything through participating in this report about how and when it might make sense to break up the category of researcher into subcategories, and when and if it ever makes sense to think about the support offerings that you're providing in slightly more granular levels of detail, as opposed to just, who's the audience, I guess, is a short way to answer this question. And how do you, are there opportunities in kind of thinking in more narrow grains about who it is that you're trying to support?
I'll jump on that. So that's a really great question, Dylan. And the interviews we did that included faculty, senior faculty, junior faculty, postdocs, and the staff working on the research projects. So, and including some of them were recent graduate students who just turned into postdoc. So when we talk about the support for big data or data research, all of these constituents have a different need. A faculty who is working on multiple projects with big data and a huge, I would say, collaborative project, they do not necessarily have to do the analysis themselves. They have graduate students or postdocs in their lab who need those skills, not exactly the faculty. So based on the question you asked, I think it would be great if we can somehow subcategorize them and their needs, and then maybe libraries will be better to support those needs. And I'll touch base on the previous question regarding that one word came again and again into our conversation, and that was ethics. Almost every researcher we interviewed, they had concern about ethics. They had expectations that someone will teach the big data or in general, more data ethics research. So bringing that to question, that was more directed towards the graduate students or postdoc or the people who were actively working on those projects and generating the data, gathering the data, and analyzing that data. So I will pass it on to you now, but yes, that is where we can actually make a better planning, strategic planning, if we can divide those pools, who we plan to support or who we are supporting, who is our audience.
Dylan, I can chime in here. It may be only tangentially related to your meat of your question, but what that makes me think of is issues around kind of tiered security and access to data, and determining exactly who will need long-term access to the data that was generated in the project, whether it's the actual student researcher generating the numbers in the spreadsheets or whatever, or if it's the PI themselves, and how do we differentiate their educational issues and their kind of support issues. And it's not something that we're seeing brought to us in those terms right now, because I don't think as we've discussed, that these labs and these teams necessarily approach the library with these ideas in mind. But it's something that comes up later towards the end of the project quite often, when suddenly students are moving to other institutions. They should no longer have access to the data, but how should they be credited for it? How should it stay associated with their academic profile? So in that sense, senior researchers versus research assistants, I would think any robust big data support education platform would be able to differentiate between them and tailor offerings so that everyone knows sort of what will be expected of them and what they'll be expected to have access to in the future.
I think that's a really important observation. I'm curious, Jen or Susan, if you have more thoughts to put in here, and maybe in particular, both Neelam and Ben have really emphasized kind of career stage as a fault line for support. Please feel free to continue along that line, but if you have something to say about how discipline might play in, that would be a welcome addition to the conversation as well.
I can try here. This is a question that I struggle with a lot. And we talk about a lot locally too. And I'll give a shout out to Maura Downey, my colleague, our research facilitator. We've had a lot of discussions around this based on the Ithaca findings. We also did some focus groups right around the same time. And she's been analyzing that data. And in those focus groups, we actually divided people based on career stage. Because we felt we didn't want to have a tenured professor and an untenured professor, the politics there. So we actually decided to divide based on career stage, and the themes that Maura found when analyzing that data and that we noticed is that the challenges they weren't different necessarily, that like the themes themselves weren't different. So take cloud computing, it was a challenge across the board. And it might be different, like an early career person might not know what was available to them locally, whereas a late career person might be doing different types of research than they had been. So they both would be considered sort of like needing something different. So I don't know, I'm probably not doing a great job saying this, but I don't know that career stages are necessarily a useful categorization always. But then I start thinking about disciplines too, and I don't know that is either because of the interdisciplinary nature of research as well. So those two buckets are really, I just struggle with wondering how useful they are, or if they're only useful for certain things. But I don't have an answer for that. So I'll just leave it there.
I'll just chime in very quickly. I don't have a whole lot to add to all of the good comments that have already been made, except to say, I think it would be wise for libraries to not forget about staff when they do outreach along these lines. A lot of the larger research groups have, lab techs, and like for us, postdocs are classified as staff. And a lot of those folks they are the institutional memory for some of these processes, especially in larger groups where the PI is kind of removed from the day-to-day. And if we can remember to target them, that is a great way to sort of keep that information flowing, because, graduate students cycle in and out of the labs, undergraduates cycle even faster in and out of the labs. And part of, I think, what's so challenging about the communication piece for libraries is it's like the constant flowing of the tides, right? There's always a new batch coming in. And if we can sort of instill some knowledge about how libraries can support big data and data more broadly in staff members who are attached to and also are intimately acquainted with the day-to-day problems of data wrangling and management, then that is a good avenue for us.
Great, thank you all. My last question before we open up the Q&A is kind of an opportunity to reflect on the big picture and one of the main patterns that I noticed reading through the local reports. And that was that a great many researchers, when they run into problems, their resource of first resort is the internet. There's a lot of people who say, oh, when I run into a coding problem, I go to Google. When I'm trying to learn how to use a new piece of software or use it in a new way, I go to these YouTube tutorials that I know about. And over again, there was a strong sense that those kind of resources were highly valued, were often the front line of support, because researchers seemed to think that they offered immediacy, that you could get an answer in real time, and that they could get kind of specific answers to very narrow questions that would allow them to carry on with their work as quickly as possible. One way of thinking about the use of those kind of resources is that they are competing with the kind of services that libraries may offer, workshops, tutorials around programming languages, things like that. Another way of framing that is that perhaps it provides opportunities for libraries to think about where the highest impact areas are and what kinds of support needs looking forward might be important to focus on. And so I guess my last question for everyone, kind of put plainly, is it bad for libraries that researchers are relying on these kind of like public resources on the internet? Or is there an opportunity here to focus on new and different kinds of services? And if so, what might those be? And this is a question for everyone, so please feel free to just jump in.
I can take a stab to start. Is it bad? It doesn't really matter because they're going to do it anyway, is my knee-jerk response. I guess I see it more as an opportunity. My institution is not staffed to tackle just-in-time inquiries across the multiple time zones where our research is happening. It's not sustainable. And I would imagine we're probably not outliers there. So if we can invest time in making self-service resources that are available to people, which at Northeastern we found helpful too, just for triaging limited staff time already more broadly. So, you know, a very common response in my group to an initial inquiry about, you know, how do I learn Tableau or something like that is often take a look at this tutorial or this guide that I made and then get in touch with us if you still have questions. So we do that pretty often. And if we can make truly useful self-service materials that are openly available and that surface nicely for the Googlers, and make it clear through branding that those come from the institution, they come from the library, and that we're available for follow-ups, I think that's a wonderful outcome for us. And I'll pass the mic.
I'll chime in really quickly. So the key word there is what Dylan said, the real-time help. So libraries, and they have their own timing and people work there like us, librarians. They may not be available every single time our researcher need us. So they go to Google to find that real-time help. But at the same time, I would say in answer to that question, it's not a bad thing. If our main purpose for our researcher is to help them. And if they are getting help through Google, that's great. That saves us some time to put our resources and our energy to make something better for them. And I'll provide you one example for that. So we have started a service that's called Data Collaboration Lab. And it's not necessarily directed towards the big data. We do all the data. And what does that service does? We bring in the data owners or the researcher, and that's mainly what we have seen until now are the graduate student. They come in with their data, and then we have volunteer people who have data analysis skills. So we kind of do a matchmaking between them. That sort of service, that sort of help, they cannot get it through Google. Very customized, very personalized help to analyze their data. So I do think when we have time away from that and our researchers are getting some information through Google, we should devote our time to services like that where we can reach out and make a real difference.
And I'd like to echo this as well. It's definitely not necessarily bad, but it is a bit of a buyer beware situation. You know, one of the things that libraries do is we collect and collate authoritative instructional knowledge, reliable things that are in theory trustworthy. Of course, understanding that science is iterative and we're always revising our understanding of things. But you know, we're not gatekeepers. We are the opposite of that. Our goal needs to be to facilitate access to the knowledge wherever it is. So, you know, with that caveat of it's like Wikipedia back in the day when it was, you couldn't trust Wikipedia, but now you can pretty much trust at least the references at the bottom of Wikipedia, right? If people are instructed or educated in how to access this data where it already is, so that we're not reinventing the wheel, and vet its reliability and authoritative quality, then that just needs to be one of the services that we provide. You know, if they're not already familiar with it, maybe we should be hiring, like we're hiring GIS librarians now, maybe we should be hiring a YouTube tutorial librarian, you know, to kind of help direct researchers towards these resources that we don't typically collect as we do our normal collections. But maybe we should be, if this is where they are going, let's facilitate that. Let's make sure they're educated in its appropriate use, and let's integrate that with the kinds of services that libraries already provide.
We're starting to get questions pile up, so I think I'm going to turn to the Q&A at this point. And I'm just going to go through the questions in the order that they were submitted. Great, I think we're basically out of time. I'm going to turn things back to the organizers here to do the outro, but thank you all for participating in this conversation.
Great. Thank you, Dylan, and thank you to all of our panelists. At this point, I'll just wrap up with some logistics. So we're going to be ending in about a minute and then taking a 15-minute break before our next session, which will be the RDAP Journal Club happening at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It'll run for about 50 minutes before we have another 10-minute break, and then we have our closing business meeting and closing remarks happening at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Both of these next two sessions will be happening in different Zoom sessions and Zoom links. So you'll want to go back to Whova to find those links to access those sessions. So again, thank you everyone for attending this session, and we'll see you at our next two sessions, and enjoy your 15-minute break. Bye everyone.
Bye everyone.